Our next speaker on stage is Hector Moran. He will talk about sculpting. Sculpting is a very interesting process for all artists who are in the animation scene. And maybe you see the sculpting process on the big electronic stores. You can print out your 3D models, and that's the stuff from Hector.
Is it on? Okay.
Yeah.
Just give me a second here. I brought a few prototypes and final products of things that I've worked on. And so yeah, I'm gonna just plop them right here and then get right to it. So yeah, hi, my name is Hector Moran. And when I was putting together the presentation for today, I started just kind of putting this little collage together, and I kind of realized that between toys, video games, graphics, fan art, and characters for animation, I'm probably past the 100 characters for production mark. And this is not everything, so this is a selection. But yeah, part of that has also made me realize I've been around a while. So yeah, who's this guy, right? So I'm a freelance character artist, and basically in a nutshell, some of that means that on a good year, I can choose my own projects. I do get to choose my own clients. I fight for projects that I want if I really want a project, and there's been a few examples of that. One thing that I'm trying to transition a bit into is being an independent artist, and for me that means creating my own little properties, my own maybe either comic book type properties or just kind of my own little collectibles lines. And yeah, with that I just kind of I have to learn new things, and some of that, for example, the skull that you see there, if you can see it from where you're sitting, that's from my own printer. And basically what I'm doing these days is that I have my own printer and I'm starting to learn to use it and get better results with it. So that has its own learning curve. I'm also a part-time teacher, and I also made too many slides for today, so I'm gonna go pretty fast through some of them. So sorry if some of this starts feeling a bit rushed. But just to show a few examples of projects that I've worked for. During my first year freelancing on my own, I was lucky enough to do a few skins for League of Legends. That's one of the most known game projects that I've gotten the chance to work on, so that was pretty cool. And just last year, I did a few characters for Spirit Walk's Shardbound. That's another MOBA game. So I started in 3D printing with a project called Kingdom Death. I started on that project during around 2009, 2010. I did some of my first miniatures for that. And that was the guy that made Kingdom Death. His name is Adam Putz. And he was one of the first independent creators working with 3D printing for miniatures. Back then, it was not really that much of a thing. So this was like the very beginning of some of that. By the time I went freelance in 2012, I did a lot of work for Kingdom Death. And that was the year when Kingdom Death went on Kickstarter and broke records for board games by raking in $2 million for the first Kickstarter. A few years later, they did a reprint and an expansion of the game, and that went and did also another record-breaking $12.3 million. And it's a very niche sort of game. It's sort of like, the way I could describe it is Dark Souls, but in board game format. With a lot more anime influence. And so yeah, that's one of the projects that I worked on, and that was basically the first 3D print related project that I got to work on. these two are big for me. These two are big projects that I got to work on, and I was really happy to be a part of. And these are two examples of something that, as a freelancer, I wanted and I kind of fought for. So Mega Man was a board game that was made a few years ago, and I knew the company that was doing the miniatures for that game. I had worked for them, but they hadn't called me about doing miniatures for this game. So when I heard that they were doing miniatures for this game and they hadn't called me, I called my client and I'm like, hey, what's up, man? So I basically elbowed my way into doing miniatures for this project. And eventually I kind of was given all of the miniatures of Mega Man himself to do because Capcom really liked how I was doing the characters. A similar thing happened with Street Fighter. Street Fighter is a recent project that was kickstarted, and it reached $2 million, and that was kickstarted. It finished kickstarting in May, and I'm still finishing the characters for that. I'm doing all of the characters for it. It's around 35 characters, so it's 35 miniatures by one crazy dude. So yeah, my own projects are also something that I'm pursuing, and you can see there just a bit of a collage of some of the ones that I'm doing. At the center in the bottom, you see my printer, and that's sitting in my office. It's pretty big. It's a big machine. But I waited a long time until I decided to finally buy a machine for myself. I kind of wanted to wait until because the technology kept going up and up and up and improving. And if you don't wait for a bit of a plateau in the technology, you can buy something that ends up being obsolete within a few months, and you don't want that. So I was waiting, and this seemed to be the right time. These are also on the top there. These are a few other projects of miniatures that I basically kind of made, and I kickstarted or I put on Indiegogo, and I self-funded. They're small projects, but they're kind of small steps towards this whole independent artist thing that I'm also trying to do. So yeah, I started in the industry, in video games industry, back in 2005. I started a studio called Streamline, and in that studio, it was an outsourcing studio, so they were doing graphics for video games. Some of the video games that we got to work on there. The first video game I ever worked on was Saints Row. I started as an environment artist on Saints Row, and I did several buildings for that game. And then eventually I worked on Overlord. At that studio, I didn't personally work on some of the Gears of War stuff because at that point I was a lead artist and I didn't get hands-on working on some of that stuff. I only got to supervise some of the artists doing some of those projects like Battlefield 2042 and Unreal. Those were projects that I was more supervising artists now and then rather than creating content for. I ended up moving to Vienna, Austria, after the previous studio was in the Netherlands. That's part of how I came to be in Europe. And yeah, in Austria, in Vienna, I got to work on some of these projects that you see here. And I worked at that studio for 3 years. But while I was working at that studio, I kept trying to build my online presence. I was participating in forums and communities. And through building that online presence, I started getting freelance work on the side. And the nice thing about having freelance work while you are having a full-time job is that you have all the leverage. If a client comes to you with a shitty project that is not paying well, and you don't need their money, you don't need their project. So if you have a full-time job and you're being offered freelance jobs, you can just take the ones that you want, and that's basically what I did. I got a lot of freelance offers when I was working at this studio, and I turned a lot of them down because they were either not offering me the money that I was asking for, or because they were not interesting projects. So that was nice. And after 3 years at Sproing, I went freelance. So that was in 2012. This is just some of the logos of some of the companies that I worked for. So you see, for example, Hasbro and Schleich. So Schleich is one of the toy companies that I've been working for in the past few years, and that's one of the little mermaids that I made for them. I've made a few of those, and I also made one fairy last year for them. And I enjoy that kind of work. I enjoy making toys now, basically. That's kind of fun. So yeah, I'm going to cover, and I'm going to cover in a hopefully not too rushed fashion, but also still interesting fashion, some of the process and some of the differences between because by now I've been working on video games, animation, and also toys and collectibles and all these things, and they all share the aspect of what I call high-res, or the sculpting, basically, and that's all done in ZBrush. They all share that aspect. And everything else that comes after, it just kind of branches slightly differently. But I've become proficient enough at doing those kind of different technical requirements that I can work on all of these industries. As a freelancer, that has provided me also a lot of freedom and a lot of protection if the video games industry is having a console transition and things are kind of quiet, I can just work on games. I can work on board games, or I can work on miniatures or toys. So I always have a bit of different industries that I'm doing work for. So one of the things that I wanted to cover, and maybe I'm not sure if there will be enough time to cover this more depth, but things like the core aesthetics of something, like when you are designing, when you are sculpting and making figures, there's a lot of things that you need to get good at, that you need to do well. And for example, one of my favorite games in recent history was actually the Disney Infinity game. I grew up in Mexico, but I grew up with a lot of Marvel comics. So I was a big fan of the X-Men from the 90s, and I was also a big fan of the art style that the guys that made Disney Infinity came up with. And because of rights and other things happening with Marvel, the X-Men were not going to happen on Disney Infinity. So I decided, you know what? I have the power to do this. I'm going to make my own X-Men in the Disney Infinity art style, and so I did. Sorry. And when I did this, I learned a lot. I learned a lot about working with very few lines, very few shapes, and a lot of simplicity. It forced me to strip down into simple lines and simple shapes and make those good. And you can learn a lot from that kind of exercise. So, of course, another type of aesthetics is like more realism or more detail. And I've done a bit of that also, for example, with this project of mine. But the thing is, with projects that are more complex, more detailed, you have to become consistent. I mean, shape language and all these things, it's some of the stuff that Muke was talking about. And these things apply to characters. These things apply to basically everything that you're trying to do in a visual medium. So this whole aspect of core aesthetics is just basically making the high-resolution source asset as good as possible. So some of the things you have to consider when you're making your high-res stuff is there going to be facial animation? For example, when I made the skins for League of Legends, those characters are really tiny on screen, and they don't have facial animations. Their mouths are shut, and their eyes are just open. They don't have an eyeball that you can rotate, and the eyes don't blink. These are flat faces that are just textured. So these become aspects that also play a part in your high-res asset creation. So yeah, like you have to ask yourself questions during this process, like is there facial animation? How's the character gonna move? Do they have any weird special weapons? Is there hair or fur on the production? All these things, of course, come into play when you're doing this high-res designing or sculpting. Of course, when it comes to printing, how big you're going to be printing something is a bit of a concern, because that starts dealing with weight and balance. Then, of course, if you're doing something just for a one-off print, like the skull that I have there, then you don't have to concern yourself with as many things as you do when you have to do something for mass production. I'll try to get a bit more into that if there's enough time. So yeah, this whole functionality thing, it just basically covers the aspects of what's on the character. Does it have hair? Does it have fur? All these things that I was just asking and mentioning. But the other thing that you need to also watch out for is that you don't let those expectations or technical restrictions restrict the design. When I make a miniature, when I sculpt a toy, when I sculpt a miniature, that is often based on really cool concept art. And what I try to do first is I try to match the concept art, and then I concern myself with the technical aspects of the miniature. Like, are things thick enough? Is the hair gonna break off? I don't worry myself with that when I'm trying to match the concept. And then when I finished matching the concept and the client is happy, then I go in and add in some of those changes. So yeah, what I use for this part of the process is of course ZBrush. That's just a screen cap from the Pixelogic ZBrush page, webpage. And so you can see just in that image what ZBrush is used for, and it's basically everything, you know. You have it in movies, you have it in video games, illustration, advertising, 3D printing. And I've worked on a lot of these fields with the exception of automotive design, jewelry design, and scientific visualization. Everything else I've basically done a bit of something for. So video games. Video games, if you guys are familiar with, of course, low poly, high poly, all these things. When you're making your low poly, what you saw before in the previous slides concerns the high poly, right? Like just making your sculpture that you will later use to turn into a production asset. Of course, in this aspect, you have to think about things like, what's your game genre? What are the platform specs? Is this for the Switch? Is this for a PS4? Is this for PC? Those are some of the technical specs and expectations. Then, of course, you're dealing with different art styles, and different art styles are going to have sort of different expectations and requirements. Depending on your game genre, like League of Legends, for example, the camera is a big concern. Your characters actually, the design of the characters, the guys that do the concept of the characters, they kind of have to concern themselves with how this character will look from a top angle that is slightly tilted, right? Because that's the main angle that this character is going to be seen from. So you have to try to create a good silhouette for that camera angle if possible. Continuing on, it's, yeah, triangles, triangles, triangles. One of the things that basically still defines and separates animation topology and video game topology is triangles. So this is actually not the marketing art from Team Fortress. This is actually a fan art. Someone that did that same marketing art, but with very few polygons and very few pixels. The guy's name is Tom Talion. So this is not a piece by me, but I wanted it to illustrate this right here. That's the wireframe of this character. It's super, super low. And basically, that could have been for a platform like the Game Boy, like the Game Boy, no, the 3DS, I guess. That would have been a platform for it. Or maybe this could have also worked for a mobile version of Team Fortress. But this was just the artist messing around and limiting himself to a few pixels and a few polygons. Because there's an art in there, just as you saw in the previous talk about pixel art. There's an art in very low resolution, low polygon and low resolution texture art. That texture that you see on this guy, for example, is 128 by 128 pixels. You get on Photoshop at some point and try making a canvas of 128 by 128 pixels and see how far you get when making a texture with that many pixels. It's hard. So moving along with this whole topology thing. This is an example from Uncharted, and you can see in his pants and in a few areas, this is mostly quads, basically polygons that have 4 sides, but there's a few triangles, and that's what gives it away as a video game model. That's from Uncharted 2, and this is the comparison between Uncharted 2 Drake and Uncharted 4 Drake. So the budgets have gone up a bit. You can work with more polygons. And what you also see in this screenshot is that at this point, the topology is very similar to subdivision topology. If you're not familiar with what subdivision topology is, I'm going to see if maybe I have enough time to go into that. But yeah, of course, when it comes to texturing in video games, you have your different texture maps that you have to deal with. And for a character like this League of Legends has a painterly art style. So you end up basically doing a lot of lighting and a lot of all the color and all these things in your textures. But actually, a lot of those maps are generated just from the high-res sculpt. A lot of that is not hand-painted. There's very little hand-painting on this texture from Katarina. This is a slightly more modern example, and I mean, you have now the new lighting models of PlayStation 4 and Xbox One and modern PC games. Now you're dealing with what they call PVR, physically based rendering. And this all just means that it's more mathematically correct and that you're using now different software. And there are things that go faster and easier with that software, like with Substance. And there are things that will take longer because now you're expected to do more. So this thing is always kind of moving. So animation topology, this is basically where you're dealing with all quads because this is going to be subdivided and then rendered, right? So we're not in video games anymore. This is animation, and I've done a lot of characters for animation. And so that's a slightly different approach to the topology. So topology, to kind of put it in an example, you have these two images that kind of look the same, but if you look at the wireframe on the ones on that side, you can't make a wireframe that bad if you tried. So I actually had to try to make a really bad wireframe to illustrate basically what's probably going to get you fired or get the rigger to hate you in a studio if you mess up your wireframes that bad. So yeah, if you're interested in going more into this kind of thing, just take a picture of that slide. Or just write a note down about this kind of thing. It's topology for subdivision. There's a lot of resources about this these days. There's a lot of places where you can find good information on how to do good topology. Some of these things I kind of had to learn with time and with trial and error because these things were not available back when I was starting some of this. But all these resources are there now, so hopefully that helps you. Topology for faces and characters, that's also a big thing. And one cool thing about good topology is that it tends to look or follow the flow of the muscles on a human face, for example. At least it tries to complement them or go along with them. And for that, again, there's also good resources out there. There's people like Danny Mac, who has made a few tutorial videos. So yeah, that's something to also dig into. Texturing for animation, of course, it's also changing, it's also evolving. But you kind of, when you're doing textures for animation that is pre-rendered, unless you are doing it intentionally as an art style, you don't have to paint lighting into your textures. So for example, the textures on these guys, these two on the left, there's almost no lighting in the textures of that because that's all done by the lighting engine and the rendering engine, and then also by the lighting in the scenes. The second guy is a combination because there is lighting painted into his textures, so it's kind of like a painted puppet. And then on top they do lighting, right, that is pre-rendered. So this is just a screen grab of what's going on between games and pre-rendered graphics. It's a constant arms race, basically, and they're not necessarily racing or competing with each other, but in certain ways, the video game engines are catching up. And they've been catching up for a long time, but of course, then the render engines keep improving and keep evolving. So you get things like, back in the day, you had this skin from Quake. It had all the lighting, all the skin texture detail painted, and the lighting in the engine was horrible. It was garbage. Now you have things like The Last of Us and The Last of Us 2 and Uncharted, all of these games. I'm a fan of Naughty Dog, so I just grab examples from them. And all of the stuff that you see in the trailers from The Last of Us 1 and 2, and it's all in-game. It's all real time. and it looks as good as some rendered stuff looked a few years ago, right? So it's constantly evolving. So 3D printing, I'm almost out of time. But when it comes to 3D printing, you of course have to concern yourself with something that is not really a concern in animation, at least for the character artist. If you are not the animator and the rigger of your own characters, then you are basically handing on your character, usually in that pose, either the T pose or the A pose. And that's it. Your job is done at that point. But when it comes to miniatures, toys, and other things like that, wow, that slide got messed up. So this is just showing a few of the stages of me constructing a character for a miniature. In some cases, I already sculpt the hair in post, because if I know that the hair is kind of going to be wind blown, so I already built that. So of course, I start out, my workflow for miniatures, toys, and all these things still involves a T-pose character. Oh man, what happened to those? So yeah, posing, when you start dealing with characters in pose, you start having to learn anatomy more in depth also. You start having to gather more references. These days, there's a lot of good reference out there, of course. There's websites that offer you entire scans of humans in multiple poses. And you can learn more from that. So I have a lot of those resources in my own personal library. Again, going back to this Disney Infinity example, you learn a lot from doing with restrictions, okay? In a similar way to how pixel art teaches you what is really essential and what's really important to worry about, an art style like the Disney Infinity art style forces you to do as good as possible, do really nice, elegant shapes with just a few colors and a few forms and a few lines. So this, again, was another really good exercise, which allowed me to take a lot of the knowledge that I learned from doing that Disney Infinity fan art. That fan art allowed me to basically become better at doing a lot of the things that I'm dealing with right now in this huge cast of characters that I'm working on for Street Fighter. Of course, there's things that you have to concern yourself with, like scale, water tightness, and cuts and keys. These are things that are concerning in relation to mold making, because your 3D prints are only the master print of something, right? And that master print becomes what gets turned into a mold. From the mold, you can mass produce toys, miniatures, and all these things. So yeah, the breakup that you have to do for that, it involves a little bit of like engineering, but not like really fancy complex engineering. You just have to kind of think about what you're doing in the breakup of the pieces and then just get them ready for printing. And there's no hard kind of science to this. You just kind of get better as you practice it, and you start growing an intuition for when a line is deep enough in a sculpture, and when something is thick enough that it's going to print at the scale that you'll be dealing with. Another part of print prep can be that you break up your model into something that will be easy to paint. So that's a friend of mine painting that Deadpool prototype, and I specifically cut up the parts of that Deadpool in a way that would be easier and quicker to paint, and it worked out pretty well for that. Sorry. So that's pretty much as far as I got with that. Questions?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hector. Very interesting talk, very interesting niche in the gaming animation scene. What do you expect in the future from 3D printing? Because it's evolved in the last 10 years very, very fast.
I'm very curious how color 3D printing will evolve, because that's going to create another kind of subset of the industry that could, for designers and people that make their own customs like I can do, that's going to open up a whole new area of kind of boutique custom sculptures and toys that you could do for people that don't mind paying, I I don't know, a few $100 for a figure. There are collectors that will pay even thousands. So that opens up a whole area that is going to be interesting. For now, I'm just curious to get better with the resin printing that is not colored. But I'm very curious to see how colored printing will evolve, because it's coming along really nicely.
Questions? Oh, yes, fine.
Thank you. I have a question for you. Do you want to focus on 3D printing on the future, or do you have plans to work for bigger games again?
If video game work comes my way and it looks fun, I'll do it. And if all I get through the rest of the year is going to be more miniatures or more statues. Like, I want to do a few more statues. Because I've done a few larger statues. There's a game coming out at the end of the year called Biomutant, and I made this special edition statue for that one. That comes with the special edition of the game. And I want to do a bit more of that, and I have a chance at doing it because I have some clients that can get me in that. But if video game work comes my way, like the stuff from Shardbound, I was a fan of the art style of that game. I wasn't playing the game, but I saw the art and the characters, and I liked the art style, so I was like, hell yeah, I'll do something for that. So if something else interesting comes my way, I've turned down work, for example, for video games, doing shooters with realistic soldiers. That doesn't interest me. I have more fun doing something like a League of Legends character. I'm no good at making really clean, perfect, hard surface things like weapons. That's just not my gig. So if work like that comes my way, I turn it down. And but yeah, at the moment I'm basically not too worried about what to focus on. The good thing about how I've managed my career is that I've focused on characters, but I didn't focus on characters for miniatures only, right? So I'm able to jump between video games, toys, and everything that is out there, yeah.
So you don't play the games you're creating? Like
not all of them, no. Like I have friends that, for example, that are working in Vienna on skins for Overwatch, and they also played Overwatch a lot. I tried Overwatch myself, and I just got killed a lot. So there are some games that I enjoy, but many of the games that I've had the chance to work on are not always the kind of games that I play, but they are games with a nice art style that I like. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, I guess.
Sorry.
I work on ZBrush as well, and I kind of love it. I come from a sculptural background, actually, and as you can imagine, I get lost in performance questions a lot, especially when interactivity is a topic. Can you hint me towards a workflow that might help me along in my questions about how to translate the fine detail of my sculptures to like texturing and displacement solutions?
Are you going to be at the meet and greet by any chance?
I don't know, but I'll try to after this point.
Yeah, if you get a chance, maybe I can go more in depth.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
as far as like a lot of it comes with practice.
Yeah, sure.
And as far as performance, there are ways of breaking up your subtools so that you don't push the poly count too high on one single subtool. So there are little tricks that here and there. I'm also, my website is really easy to remember, is hec.mx, and it has a link to my Twitch. And then if you join one of my Twitch streams at some point, you might see some of the ways that I handle my subtools that kind of keep things manageable. But yeah, it's kind of long topic, but it's one of those things that just gets better as you do it. You just keep doing these things, and you start learning your own workarounds and things that work with your machine also, because we all have our own specific limitations with that, right? But yeah, hopefully that answers at least some of it.
Yeah, looking forward to the meet and greet and the Twitch. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, you find the talk from Hector on YouTube later. There you can find all his slides. one last question. You talk about your miniatures. Are you a collector?
By now I am, because of how many... I have a bunch of board games that I've played a little bit, or I haven't played at all at home because I worked on them. And there are some miniatures that I've gone to miniature shows, and like they're from sculptors that I like, so I've bought a few, and yeah, it's starting to... I have too many chunks of plastic in the shape of people in my house.
Okay. I'm looking forward for the Biomutant.
Yeah, that looks like a really fun game.
It's a very cool game.
Yeah.
Expected it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much,
Yeah.
Hector.
Thank you.
Oh, I forget. The present.
Thank you.